"Let my father go and I'll make you walk." The court laughed, until they saw the judge stand up on his own. The courtroom was packed, but there was no hope in the air, only the weight of a sentence already decided. Matteo Sandoval, a poor father, sat with his head down, awaiting judgment like a man who already knew his fate. On the other side, the prosecutor spoke with disdain, almost laughing. "A man like this doesn't deserve mercy." Some people in the back nodded in agreement, whispering that the only good criminal is one behind bars. The atmosphere was one of indifference and predetermined condemnation. And then an unexpected sound broke through. Small footsteps. A 7-year-old girl walked down the aisle. Livia, Matteo's daughter, her voice soft but steady, echoed through the room. It wasn't a request. It was a promise. If the judge freed her father, she would make him walk again. The first reactions were bursts of laughter, mocking chuckles, looks that said, "Poor delusional child." Even the prosecutor scoffed, "This is ridiculous." But the girl didn't back down. She walked up to the front and placed her tiny hands on the lifeless legs of Judge Edgar Lencastre, a man infamous for his severity and for the fact that he had been confined to a wheelchair for 15 years. That's when the impossible happened. As if time itself had stopped, Edgar felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died long ago. A warmth, a forgotten strength. The silence swallowed the laughter as, with effort, he pushed himself up. The wood of the chair creaked. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge was standing for just a few seconds, but standing. The crowd's eyes widened, their breath caught. None of it made sense. It was a miracle, right before their eyes. Edgar, however, panicked. He let himself fall back down. His stern face tried to mask the shock, but his hand trembled as it gripped the gavel. Pride spoke louder than the impossible, and with the harshest voice he could muster, he pronounced Matteo's sentence. This time, no one laughed. The room went silent. The father was taken away. The daughter returned to her seat, and Edgar, motionless in his chair, seemed to have condemned himself along with that man. When he closed the door to his chambers, away from everyone's eyes, he pressed his sweaty hand against his still trembling leg. Livia's gaze lingered in his mind, not filled with hatred, but with compassion. And then, alone, he whispered to himself, "What was that?" From the moment the courtroom fell silent, Edgar was never the same again. That night, alone in his quiet apartment, he closed his eyes and still saw the scene. The little girl, her small hands on his legs, the collective laughter turning into silence. And him, standing, after 15 years, he tried to convince himself it was imagination, a trick of the mind, some involuntary reflex. But his hands shook whenever he remembered. The sensation was there, etched into his body like a fresh scar. The stone-faced judge couldn't sleep. The next day, the courthouse halls were buzzing with whispers about the episode. Some said it had been staged. Others swore they'd seen it with their own eyes. Edgar rolled down the corridor in his chair, as if nothing had happened, but inside he carried the weight of an impossible secret. That was when Livia appeared again, alone. She held something small, hidden in her palm. When she came closer, she looked him in the eyes with a disarming firmness. "You need to see this." She handed him the flash drive and walked away. No explanation, no request, just the certainty that he would watch it. Edgar kept the object as if it were forbidden evidence. He waited for nightfall, shut the door to his chambers, and with his heart pounding, plugged the device into his computer. The screen lit up. The video showed a modest room, worn walls, old furniture. Matteo sat on the couch, combing his daughter's hair. The clock on the wall marked the exact time of the robbery. He had been home, there was no doubt. Edgar watched it again, and again. The judge, so used to hunting for flaws in every detail, searched for cuts, shadows, any sign of editing, but he found nothing. The video was real, and the truth hit him like a punch. Mateo was innocent. A chill ran down his spine. The judge, who prided himself on never hesitating, now felt guilt weigh heavier than ever. He opened the case files. Pages he already knew by heart now screamed irregularities. Testimonies copied almost word for word. Patrol times that didn't match. Incomplete reports. And all the evidence handled by the same man, Officer Osvaldo. The pieces formed something rotten. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a setup, and Edgar had been the final cog in that machine. His pride began to crack. For the first time in years, he couldn't look at himself in the mirror. He left the courthouse late that night. The city seemed darker than usual. He got into his car, started the engine, and quickly noticed another vehicle behind him. Slow, persistent. At every corner, the headlights stayed in his rearview mirror. His heart raced. His hands on the steering wheel were ice cold. For miles, Edgar felt the weight of an unseen gaze he knew was there. Only when the car turned down another street did he breathe again. But the fear didn't leave. It was branded into his skin. Back at his apartment, he set the flash drive on the table and stared at it like a bomb about to explode. The silence of the night seemed to scream. Two thoughts echoed relentlessly. He had condemned an innocent man, and someone powerful didn't want the truth exposed. That dawn, Edgar understood something that would haunt him forever. If he pushed forward, there would be no turning back. The days that followed were torment. Edgar, who had always lived on certainties, now found himself surrounded by questions that consumed him. The video wouldn't leave his mind. The image of Mateo caring for his daughter was too vivid, too strong to ignore. He tried the formal path, reached out to colleagues in the public defender's office, hinted at reopening the case, but all he found were closed doors. "The case is airtight, Your Honor." Too airtight. It was as if the entire system had been numbed against the truth. The more he insisted, the clearer it became. To touch that case was to stir something dangerous. Even so, he requested authorization to visit Mateo in prison. When he entered the cold visiting room, the weight of his own sentence fell on him. The man before him wasn't a criminal. He was a worn-down father, tired, but with the dignity of someone who only wanted to return home. Edgar held his rigid posture, but inside a fracture widened. Condemning innocence, was that the price of his pride? At that moment, Livia appeared, accompanied by a simple neighbor who confirmed, on the night of the crime, she had been at the house with them. Another piece, another ignored proof. And then something unexpected happened. For the first time, Edgar spoke not as a judge, but as a man. He didn't confess, but he let it slip. Something unexplainable had touched him in that courtroom, something he still couldn't understand. It was enough. In that moment, between the rigidity of a judge and the innocent faith of a child, an impossible partnership was born. Edgar and Livia began gathering names, times, forgotten details. He with his cold logic, she with her disarming courage. But the enemy moved too. One morning, when Edgar arrived home, he found his window shattered. On the floor lay a rock wrapped in a note. Judges fall too. The chill that coursed through him wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that he was now at war. And the question that lingered was, how far would he be willing to go to correct his own mistake? Darkness didn't come all at once. It arrived in signs, doors that shut too quickly, glances that turned away, phones that rang and then fell silent. The more Edgar dug into Mateo's case, the more he felt he was walking down a windowless corridor. He decided to confront Osvaldo directly. No intermediaries. A cold room, plain table, 2 chairs, a clock that seemed to drag on purpose. The officer walked in with an easy stride, the confidence of a man who had already won before the game began. He didn't ask for coffee, didn't bother with formalities. He just held his gaze. A heavy silence filled the space. Edgar opened his notepad, listed the inconsistencies, pressed him on chain of custody, missing cameras, conflicting timelines. Osvaldo replied with the bare minimum, always steady, always clean, too clean. When the judge mentioned the flash drive recording, the corners of Osvaldo's mouth lifted by a millimeter. Almost a smile, almost a message. He didn't say stop, but everything about him said exactly that. In the end, he leaned forward, voice low, tone like a colleague. "Are you sure you want to be involved in this?" It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like fate. Edgar walked out with his stomach churning. He breathed in the hallway like a diver resurfacing after a deep plunge. There had been no direct evidence in that conversation, but there was something worse. The feeling that truth itself was armed on the other side. That week, he buried himself in the paperwork. Files he already knew now came alive under a new light. He cross-checked patrol reports with internal bulletins, compared signatures, tracked assignments. In the middle of the night, the chill struck. Osvaldo's signature logged at 9:17 p.m. in a southern precinct, and again at 9:19 p.m. in a seizure report on the opposite side of the city. Impossible distance, impossible time. The same signature stamped like a factory seal. The discovery didn't scream, it whispered, and the whisper was enough to bring down the castle. If that piece was false, how many others weren't? Edgar printed the pages, underlined the lines, snapped photos. His body begged for rest, muscles aching, but his mind wouldn't let go. Each detail was another step out of the maze and deeper into the crosshairs. He left the courthouse late. The night carried the texture of wet asphalt, though no rain had fallen. In the parking lot, the silence felt watchful. He got into the car, started the engine, and took 2 breaths before shifting into gear. The city greeted him with scattered lights like vanishing points. The descent began smoothly. Then, the pedal sank, and nothing. The brakes didn't respond. First came disbelief, a fraction of a second where the mind searches for another explanation. Then, pure panic. Hands gripping the wheel, gears useless, wind rising at the window. The car picked up speed as if someone were pushing it downhill. Edgar yanked the handbrake, felt the skid, the sharp stench of burning rubber. A horn tore through the night. The curve loomed violent. He didn't think of miracles, didn't think of justice. He thought of surviving. He swerved into the escape lane, gravel exploding beneath the tires, seatbelt locking against his shoulder. The car bled off speed, stones scattering until it shuddered to a stop. Silence. Only the ticking of the hazard lights, proof there was still a pulse. There, hands burning, mouth dry, Edgar understood. This wasn't a warning, it was an execution gone wrong. Someone had tampered with his car. Someone had counted on him not making it home. But he made it back. He changed the lock with mechanical movements, as if that could hold the world outside. Climbing the stairs, he found a small silhouette leaning against the doorway. Livia. No fear, no drama. Just there, like a stubborn beacon in a storm. There wasn't much to say. She looked at him with the kind of certainty only children seem to have. "If you stop now, who's going to help my dad?" The words weren't a demand. They were a reminder of what mattered. Edgar felt the blunt strike of truth. He had more to lose than he thought, and even so, retreat wasn't an option. He slept little. By morning, the mechanics confirmed it. Brakes sabotaged. A cold word with a burning effect. Instead of breaking him, it put him back in order. Fear still walked beside him, but trailing just behind was something new. Resolve. He gathered the forged signatures, built a timeline, attached screenshots from the video, time, date, clock on the wall, and drafted a technical report. No adjectives, no drama, just facts sharp enough to cut. The phone rang late in the afternoon. Institutional number. Neutral voice. "Internal affairs. We need to talk. We're interested. And in a hurry." No courtesy, no kindness. Just time running short and the promise of a meeting the next day, room this, hour that. The kind of summons that could save or crush. Edgar hung up and listened to his own heartbeat. This could be the opening he needed, or a doorway into an even darker corridor. Outside, the city carried on indifferent. Inside, he finally knew the answer to Livia's question. Stopping was not an option. On the desk, the marked pages, the impossible signature, the flash drive beside them, each object seemed to carry its own gravity. A gust slipped through the window, flipped the top page, revealed a penciled line. Truth without courage is just paper. He closed the file, drew a deep breath, and chose the path he'd always avoided, the one where law and life meet without protection. Tomorrow, he would face internal affairs. Help or trap. It didn't matter. The price of disturbing the darkness was already being charged, and he had decided to pay. The hours before the meeting with Internal Affairs dragged longer than any trial. Edgar prepared with reports, notes, evidence. Every detail was a line of defense against the lie that had swallowed Matteo. But deep down, he knew darkness would not wait for the law to act. The confirmation came that very night. As he left the courthouse, he heard footsteps behind him. Not hurried, calculated, steady. Turning the corner, he came face to face with Osvaldo. The officer wasn't in uniform, but carried the same aura of authority. "You should have stopped back in the courtroom. You should have left that man there." The voice was calm, but the eyes burned with fury. Edgar tried to pull back, but before he could react, the weight of the threat hit him. This was no longer a game of documents. It was life or death. In that instant, a small shadow broke into the scene. Livia. Somehow, she was there. She stepped forward, fragile in body but immense in voice. "I'm not afraid of you. Lies are what's weak." The unexpected courage of a child froze even the officer. The street's silence grew heavy, as if the whole world held its breath. Edgar, frozen in his chair, watched with burning eyes. The girl's life was at risk because of him. Before the worst could happen, sirens split the night. Internal Affairs vehicles flooded the street, blue lights bouncing off the walls. Osvaldo tried to run, but was surrounded. Handcuffs, shouted orders. The officer, who had seemed untouchable, was shoved against the hood of a car. Edgar felt the pressure in his chest release in waves. But relief was short-lived. Matteo was still behind bars. The victory was partial, and the war far from over. In the chaos, Livia approached him. She didn't speak. She only held his hand with the grip of someone who believes, not someone who begs. And there, in the middle of the storm, Edgar made a promise, not as a judge, but as a man. "I will fix what I did wrong." The question that remained was, would the system let him? On the morning of the new trial, the city seemed to stand still. Journalists crowded at the courthouse doors. Onlookers whispered in the hallways. Attorneys exchanged glances like men sensing an earthquake coming. Everyone knew this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. The courtroom was full, but the silence was nothing like before. No laughter, no contempt, only expectation, tension in the air, as if all were waiting for the ground to break open. When Edgar entered, still in his wheelchair, all eyes locked on him. The same man who weeks earlier had seemed carved from stone now carried a different presence. He was no longer just the severe judge. He was someone ready to expose wounds, no matter the cost. The trial opened. At first, the prosecutor, confident, straightened his papers and delivered his routine speech. But soon he realized the tide had shifted. Edgar began presenting the evidence, one piece at a time. First, the flash drive. The video played on a makeshift screen. Matteo at home, combing his daughter's hair, the wall clock showing the exact time of the crime. Murmurs rippled through the audience. A collective shock. Then came the neighbor's testimony, once ignored, now heard with full attention. The woman, simple but steady, repeated, "I was there. He never left the house. Next, the patrol reports. Edgar highlighted the gaps, the contradictions, the impossible schedules. The prosecutor tried to intervene, but his voice faltered. Credibility was slipping through his fingers. And then the final proof. 2 signatures from Osvaldo, recorded at different locations within impossible minutes of each other. Edgar held the pages high, showing the crowd like a gaping wound. This isn't negligence. This is fraud. With each piece of evidence, another brick of the lie collapsed, and with each fallen brick, faces in the audience changed. People who once despised Matteo now looked away in shame. Some whispered wordless apologies, others wiped quiet tears. Then Edgar did what he had never done before. He stopped speaking as a judge and spoke as a man. Justice is not paper. Justice is courage. If we stay silent before corruption, we become its accomplices. I failed to see what was right in front of me. Today, I repair my mistake. Absolute silence. The gavel struck. Matteo Sandoval, not guilty. Matteo collapsed, not in surprise, but in relief. The weight of months, perhaps a lifetime of injustice, lifted in that instant. The tears he had held back in prison flowed freely in the open, before everyone. And then, before the audience could recover, a child's voice broke the air. Livia. She walked to the judge's bench, small, serene, with the same firmness she had shown on the very first day. "Can I pray for you again?" This time, no one laughed. No one dared interrupt. The entire courtroom held its breath, as if awaiting a promised miracle. Edgar hesitated for a moment. Pride urged him to refuse, but guilt, truth, and that small, outstretched hand spoke louder. He nodded. Livia knelt, placed her hands on his legs, and began to pray softly. The judge closed his eyes, his heart raced, a wave coursed through his body. He tried to rise. His hands trembled against the arms of the chair. His body, shaking, responded. Slowly, as though fighting the impossible, he began to stand. A collective gasp filled the room. People rose from their seats, some with hands over their mouths, others clutching tears. The sound was disbelief and hope woven together. Edgar stood. One step, then another. The soles of his shoes echoed like thunder in the silence. Each movement seemed impossible, but it was happening in front of everyone. The same courtroom that had once laughed at a child's faith now wept together. Some spectators hid their faces in their hands. Others whispered apologies to their own complicit silence. Even the mockers stood, stunned, unable to deny what they saw. Edgar stopped at the center of the room. Heart pounding, eyes brimming, and breaking a lifetime of pride, he turned to Matteo. "I failed you." The words fell heavy but true. Matteo rose, tears already flowing. His trembling but firm voice rang out, "You took my freedom, but today you gave me back my dignity." The impact was devastating. The audience broke into open sobs. It was no longer just the acquittal of an innocent man. It was the redemption of a judge and of all who were present. The gavel struck one last time, not merely as a legal act, but as a symbol of something greater, justice with courage, not just with laws. Days later, far from cameras and formality, Edgar walked slowly down a quiet street, flowers in hand. He knocked on Matteo's door. Livia answered, her wide smile lighting the entrance. The house smelled of fresh coffee, walls lined with old photos, warmth Edgar hadn't known in years. They sat around the table. Matteo served cake, and in that room there were no defendants, no judges, just 3 souls bound by pain overcome. Edgar set the flowers on the table. No explanation was needed. Matteo clasped his hand tightly. In that grip, more than forgiveness was sealed. Friendship was born. Then Livia, with the lightness only children carry, stood up and held out her hand. "Will you dance with me?" Edgar chuckled, embarrassed. a judge used to deciding fates, now invited to spin clumsily in a small living room. But he stood, he accepted. She led, he followed awkwardly. He stumbled, laughed at himself, and the girl burst into joyous laughter, as if she had just conquered the world. Matteo, leaning against the doorway, watched silently, eyes wet with emotion. There were no speeches, no solemnities, only laughter, makeshift music in their hearts, and a man who had learned, late, but in time, that justice without love is incomplete. And there, in that crooked dance, Edgar wasn't just walking, he was being reborn. Now tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Leave a like and subscribe so more people can receive messages of hope like this.